Therefore, we do not get to insert ad hominem attacks. We do not get to insert baseless allegations, irresponsible speculation, which, of course, is what this computer constitutes. So now put yourself in the shoes of the Iranians. You have the CIA, which is openly hostile to you, which is engaged in an ongoing, well-funded operation to destabilize your government. The CIA is the one handling this computer. The CIA presents it to the IAEA, and then through the State Department of the United States and in cooperation with Great Britain, Germany, France, and others, we pressure the IAEA to make this computer and its data an issue. Even though the IAEA says we're not too comfortable with this computer. They're compelled to do so because at the end of the day, the IAEA is a technical organization that is responsible to its political masters, and its political masters dominate the Board of Governors, and they dominate the Security Council. And so the IAEA has to take action. They go to Iran, and they say, we need you to address these issues. Now you're the Iranians, and you're saying, wait a minute. These issues aren't technical-based. They're not legal-based. These issues are derived from a piece of intelligence of questionable provenance coming from an intelligence agency openly hostile to us. Why are you, the international inspectors, fronting for the CIA? Because that's, in effect, is what occurred. The CIA is demanding that the IAEA ask these questions, not based upon the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty or based upon, things that are relevant to Iran's legal obligations, but based upon this wild goose chase that the CIA is engaged in. And so Iran rightly says these questions have no merit, they have no bearing, they have no relevance. We're not going to answer them. And the second Iran does that, everybody jumps up and says, they're not being cooperative, they're hiding something. No, they're just refusing to play a game that the rules of which are being dictated by the CIA. That's not how it's supposed to work. So this computer, again, if it's going to be something that's going to be introduced, I think we have to go through due diligence. We have to go through due process. There's nothing ultra secret on this computer. If it came from Iran, what are we hiding? I mean, if the Iranians built this computer, what are we hiding from the world? We don't want the Iranians to know what's on a computer that the Iranians apparently built. What are we afraid of? Let's expose this computer. Let's demonstrate its veracity, its viability, by subjecting it to some honest-to-goodness forensic examination.
Well, I hate to say it, but as much as I agree with your argument, I think that, the average Sean Hannity listener who might be tuning into this show today would say that ultimately what you're arguing is that we ought to throw this stuff out on a technicality when, in fact, the court of, international relations is much more like a Guantanamo system than an American civilian trial system, and that if there are outstanding questions, there are outstanding questions. Who cares where they come from? The Iranians, you're basically making excuses for them not having to answer these very important questions about the threat that this nation poses, et cetera, like that.
There's a difference between legitimate questions and illegitimate questions. I will never say that we should not pursue legitimate questions, but one has to examine where the question comes from. I mean, it's not a technicality to say that fabricated information is fabricated information. I mean, if we had reason to believe the Iranians were pursuing a program that violated the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, then we can pursue it. And you know what? To those Sean Hannity listeners, the IAEA has done just that. I don't know if the general public is aware of the scope and breadth of the IAEA's investigation, but the Iranians have given the IAEA tremendous latitude to examine facilities and issues that are well beyond the scope of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. For that very reason, because the Iranians want to shut the door on irresponsible speculation. But you cannot introduce fundamentally flawed information into the system, especially a system that espouses legitimacy. This isn't about dismissing a real concern on a technicality. It's not as though there's really a nuclear design out there, or there's really a green salt project where that's getting laser enriched. you don't get to manufacture evidence, then introduce it and demand that an investigation occurs. You know, this isn't as though there's legitimate evidence that I'm trying to toss out on a technicality. I'm not trying to throw out a gun that has Iran's fingerprints on it. But I'm not going to allow the prosecution to build a gun from scratch and then fabricate a story around the gun and then introduce that gun. No, you don't get to ask that question because it's an illegitimate question. It has no bearing on reality, and this is where we're at. And I would hope that anybody, whether they be a Sean Hannity listener or anybody else who claims to be an American, understands the absolute of due process. That's what gives us credibility, and that's what gives us superiority over other ways and other systems out there. And I think we only at the Iraqi situation to understand the fallacy of allowing fabricated information to be introduced into a system that is judging whether or not a nation or a government, in the former case we're talking about Iraq and Saddam Hussein's government, is complying with international obligations. Have we learned nothing from Curveball? Don't we understand that a drunken Iraqi defector who is hallucinating about mobile ballistic missile labs does not constitute the basis for a legitimate investigation? That, we do toss this out not on a technicality, but because it has no bearing, it has no credibility, it has no relevance. On the other hand, if you have hard documentation out there, or if you have a scientific investigation that puts together a logical chain of events that must be examined more thoroughly, yes, you go forward and you do this. But you cannot allow unsubstantiated fabrication to be introduced as evidence. And then before we move on this computer, all I'm saying is that we need to find out if this is the genuine article. And we will know that by examining the computer forensically. And it's not that we can't. I don't think this computer, unlike this other Swiss laptop, this one hasn't been destroyed yet. It still exists. So what is the United States afraid of? I mean, I'm more than happy to help them out on this one. I'll help put together the committee that will forensically examine this, and we'll let the chips fall where they might. But I'll tell you what, the U.S. will never go for it because they know the truth of this computer. It's fabricated information put together in a manner to create the impression of Iranian wrongdoing when the reality is there's nothing there.
Well, it's still a very kind offer on your part. Speaking of which, is it okay if I keep you another few minutes here, Scott?
Sure.
Everybody, I'm talking with Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, author of Target Iran and The Art of War for the Antiwar Movement, Waging Peace, it's called. Okay, now, here's something that's of extreme importance, and it's something that I've heard conflicting arguments about back and forth. I'll tell you, most recently, Philip Giraldi, who originally broke this story for the American Conservative magazine back in 2005, told me that his understanding is that in the event of an air war against Iran, that the option of using nuclear weapons on them, regardless of how non-existent their nuclear weapons program is, remains on the table for two purposes. One would be to get at the deeply buried and reinforced nuclear facilities and other military facilities in Iran, and the other would be to hold them basically in our back pocket, I think were his words, in case they tried to fight back, to basically say you have to sit there and take it or else we'll nuke you. Then I talked to Seymour Hersh a couple of weeks ago, and Seymour Hersh told me that his understanding is that the nuclear first strike option is completely off the table and that no matter what they do, they're definitely not going to use nukes. I know that you've written about this in the past as well. Do you have any recent information along these lines?
Well, again, I have to caveat it by saying, I'm not sitting in on the inner circles, and I'm not privy to, what is, in effect, national security classified information. I will say that the Bush administration has created the legal mechanism which allows for first use of nuclear weapons in a non-nuclear environment. And the circumstances in which they could justify this, deal with, loss of life and, weapons of mass destruction. And I think the Bush administration would be able to articulate that Iran's nuclear program is considered a weapons of mass destruction program, and that first use of nuclear weapons to neutralize this, is therefore legitimate under the existing guidelines for the use of nuclear weapons. So let's just say, in theory, we can start off by noting that you can't be dismissive of any discussion that talks about American preemptive use of nuclear weapons on Iran.